Today we're going to talk about our conflict in 1898 and our war with Spain. This is the Spanish-American War that we're also referring to. And really, it's America's first major overseas involvement. We've had the Revolutionary War, we've had the War with Mexico, got us down into Mexico. But now we're actually expanding far and wide across the seas with this war. And today we're going to recount how Spain responded to the revolt it had going on in Cuba, discuss the major causes of the Spanish-American War, describe the major battles of the Spanish-American War, and explain what happened to the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. There's a lot of transformation going on, and there's a lot of different settings. You could say this is America's first major international conflict, because the settings don't only take place in the United States or in North America, but finally over in the Philippines and down in Cuba. We have to ship troops overseas to do the fighting. It's our first truly major international military conflict. Let's talk about conflict in Cuba to get started. We had conflict in Cuba because Cuba had long been a Spanish colony. And during this time, in the late 1800s, Spain begins to lose its influence. It had colonies all over Latin America back in the early part of the 1800s, and they were led down there. Simon Bolivar and a number of other revolutionaries rose up and led rebellions against Spanish rule all throughout South America. So Spain's once mighty empire that dates all the way back to the 1500s in the age of the explorers is now slowly unraveling. Spain slowly but surely is losing control over this, as a lot of countries tend to do. People locally want to be free and broken away from their colonial empire. Spain was the first to experience this, first in Latin America. Now there are problems going on in Cuba. Cuba is south of the United States, 90 miles south of Florida, down in the middle of the Caribbean. Our involvement was a chance for the United States to flex its muscles, to really begin to make more of an international presence. We get away from being an inward-looking nation, and now we're beginning to be an outward-looking nation. We're beginning to look at the world around us and say, it is time for the United States to take its rightful place amongst the power and great nations. Jose Marti was a poet and journalist who despised Spanish rule. He was someone who began writing in Cuba about the need for the Cubans, the people locally there on the island, to break free, to get a chance to escape the bounds of being under Spanish rule and establish local control. What Marti wanted was very similar to what Simon Bolivar in South America had wanted years before. Local control, and it was time for the locals to have the ability to determine their future and not be under the influence of Spain all the way across the seas in Europe. Now, he was killed in a battle in 1895 and becomes a martyr. A martyr is someone whose death becomes a symbol of a cause, and Jose Marti becomes the symbol of liberation, of that spirit of wanting to break free as a people, away from the chains and the bounds of the former colonizing country. Valeriano Weyler was sent by Spain to crush the Cuban rebellion. He successfully does this, and 200,000 Cubans die of starvation on his watch while he's colonizing country. Valeriano Weyler was sent by Spain to crush the Cuban rebellion. He successfully does this, and 200,000 Cubans die of starvation on his watch. While he was successful in keeping the Cubans under control for Spain, he also was unsuccessful in being able to handle the problems that arise from it. Disease runs through this. This is a tropical setting, and malaria is still a problem. So disease starts to rise up, and because of that, 200,000 people die under his command. This leads to actually more resentment. This continues to make people like Marti more popular, because now they begin to say, we're still under their control. We tried to rebel. We couldn't get away with it. Now we've had a great human catastrophe because of their incompetence. Well, now we're going to talk about how the United States got involved. During this time, there was a change in the media in the United States that needs to be understood to put this into context. There were newspapers in the country, but one of the things that was the new frontier in journalism at this time was the rise of the penny paper, a paper that you could buy on the street for a penny. Now the people, because they were so cheap, they gained very mass audience. And because of that, they could greatly influence the thinking of the country because they had such a great reach. One of the first to really understand this was a fellow by the name of William Randolph Hearst. Now, Hearst was born into a rather wealthy California family, and he had gotten into the newspaper business. He had taken over control of his father's New York newspaper, which, when he took it over, was a really struggling, really floundering, failing paper. But Hearst understood the ability to grab people. He really had that concept, that rare ability of people to get out and reach the public, to get the mass audience attention, and to play to the masses. Hearst was a master of this. And because of this, his paper, the New York World, would grow by leaps and bounds and become one of the most, get the mass audience attention, and to play to the masses. Hearst was a master of this. And because of this, his paper, the New York World, would grow by leaps and bounds and become one of the most influential papers across the country. And he began advocating for America to begin to expand its power overseas. He looked at the United States as a strong nation and said, now it's time for us to step up and play a role on the world stage. Hearst's ability to reach the mass audience with this message really begins to influence the thinking. Now, William McKinley in 1898 was the president at this time, and he was not that necessarily involved in foreign affairs. But he begins to bow a little bit to the public, and he understands the need to play with this message really begins to influence the thinking. Now, William McKinley in 1898 was the president at this time, and he was not that necessarily involved in foreign affairs. But he begins to bow a little bit to the public, and he understands the need to play to this message really begins to influence the thinking. Now, William McKinley in 1898 was the president at this time, and he was not that necessarily involved in foreign affairs. But he begins to bow a little bit to the public, and he understands the need to play to the public when they're calling out for something. The United States had sent a ship called the Maine down to Cuba during this time to try and keep control or help retain control of the revolution going on in Cuba. So the Spanish were in control of Cuba. The Maine was sent down there. The battleship Maine was sent there. While it was there, it mysteriously sank in the night. Now, there's a couple of different ways that history has looked at this. Some believe there was a great explosion, as our picture right here clearly shows. This is a graphic illustration, obviously, of the ship of the Maine exploding in the harbor. People believed it hit a mine planted by Spanish agents in Cuba when it hit a mine in Havana Harbor. Others believed that the ship sunk on its own and its disappearance was used as an excuse by the yellow journalists, people like William Randolph Hearst, as a rallying cry to get America involved in an overseas conflict, an expansionist conflict. Either way about it, remember the Maine becomes the rallying battle cry, printed all over Hearst newspapers. And soon, because the popularity of this message gets out, other papers who compete with Hearst have to start playing the same message. Was it really a message that was important to international affairs, or were they calling the same message out to try and keep up in a competitive marketplace? That truly was it. But these tabloid papers, started by such as William Randolph Hearst, turned the Maine into a rallying cry for the need for the U.S. to go out and get involved in Cuba and settle the Cuba question. They begin referring to it as the Cuba question. Really, the question is, should Spain continue to control an island so close to the United States? That really is the question on their minds, and people are saying Spain's weak, Spain's on its decline. No, let's push Spain out. So this is a really more something of a power grab, if you will. The U.S., after the sinking of the Maine on February 15th, the U.S. called for a declaration of war with Spain, believing that Spain had been involved in the sinking of the Maine. This got the United States immediately involved in its first true international conflict. William McKinley goes to Congress, asks for a declaration of war, and gets his declaration of war. His Secretary of War, Theodore Roosevelt, resigns as Secretary of War and goes and forms a fighting force called the Rough Riders, who are going to play a very big incident down in Cuba. So the war with Spain gets underway. And one of the things that comes out of it is something called the Teller Amendment. Now, the Teller Amendment was passed by Congress, and it stated that once Cuba was liberated from Spain, that the U.S. would have a hands-off policy towards Cuba. In other words, we're going to go down there in this war. After the war and Spain gives up control of Cuba, the Teller Amendment said, we are going to take a hands-off approach. We are not going to get involved. We are going to keep that spirit of freedom and liberty that the United States is known for, and then we're going to apply it in Cuba. We're going to let them set their own course. Let the men and women be free. That was the idea of the Teller Amendment. You could say the Teller Amendment was a way of spreading the American ideal, the American principles of freedom, equality, and democracy, and making sure that they got a chance to apply down in Cuba. So, first the fighting takes place, that we need, of course, is out in the Philippines. The Philippines are a series of, it's really an archipelago, a series of islands formed together to make a nation off the coast of China out in the Pacific. The Philippines were controlled by Spain. The United States had an interest in the Philippines because, again, similar to our conquest in Hawaii, it would give us a way to put U.S. warships in the Far East and expand our global reach. So we had an interest in what was going on down in the Philippines. George Dewey was the U.S. naval commander in the Far East, and he was sent by Secretary of War Theodore Roosevelt, before Roosevelt left office, to go and capture the Philippines. Dewey has his ships go into Manila Harbor, Manila being the capital of the Philippines, and had his gun, and he was sent by in the Far East and expand our global reach. So we had an interest in what was going on down in the Philippines. George Dewey was the U.S. naval commander in the Far East, and he was sent by Secretary of War Theodore Roosevelt, before Roosevelt left office, to go and capture the Philippines. Dewey has his ships go into Manila Harbor, Manila being the capital of the Philippines, and had his gunboats open fire on them. Dewey needed help on the mainland, really. He had his ships in the harbor and he could fire away, but he needed someone on the inside of the Philippines. And the person that he got was a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. Emilio Aguinaldo acted as the United States agent in the Philippines. He helped to make sure that our interests were played out. He acted as an espionage, really. But he had his eye on the prize. Aguinaldo eventually wanted to take over the Philippines as a republic and become its first president. So Aguinaldo was working with Dewey and the United States. This was a man who Emilio could pick sides. He could clearly see Spain's declining power, the growth of the U.S. influence. He chose sides in this conflict to further his own ambitions. Meanwhile, down in Cuba, the fighting got off to a rough start. There were some battles, but what is most remembered about the war, the Spanish-American War, were the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were the group formed by then Secretary of War Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt resigns from McKinley's post and says, I'm going to take up a force of men. We're going to get a group of men together who are going to go on horseback. We're going to form a cavalry unit. We're going to go down to Cuba and we're going to take it by storm. That was the whole idea. So the Rough Riders make their way down to Cuba. And when they get down there, they land in Santiago, Cuba. Unfortunately for them, their horses didn't arrive in time to meet the army as it came down from Florida. So they had to make do, and this led to an eventual very famous battle, the Charge Up San Juan Hill. San Juan Hill was in Santiago, was a bit of an important strategic and place within the city of Santiago. The idea was, once you could be able to capture San Juan Hill, you'd be able to shift your forces around and make Santiago no way to escape and no way for the Spanish forces down below and escape. Theodore Roosevelt makes his reputation for his charge up San Juan Hill. Leading the Rough Riders in the battle, they defeat the Spanish, capture Santiago, and Cuba falls into the hands of the United States. So, after this, and here is, in this blue line here I'm going to show you, is the route that Roosevelt took to get down to Santiago, which you can see is right here. And here on this intern map are the U.S. forces arriving, coming up San Juan Hill, and there you see the Spanish heading out as they had to retreat. They came up and around and captured Santiago from the rear. Now, after the war is settled, Spain gives up control of Cuba and the Philippines in the United States. There was a couple of other small positions like Puerto Rico that also fell to the United States. How are we going to treat these new territories as part of our empire? What we wanted to set up was what we called a protectorate, or the ability for us to protect these island nations, but for them to have their own self-rule, remembering that whole spirit of, the spirit of the American Revolution, of people being free to set their own course. Now soon what happens is there's a debate over the annexation of the Philippines. The U.S. chooses to annex the Philippines. We add the Philippines to our country. Some in Congress stand up and begin to say, now wait a minute. Wait a minute, they say. Really it was, the Philippines could be seen one of two ways. Is it a U.S. outpost for Asian trade, which is what annexing would do for us? Or where's the spirit of the founding fathers in this? Shouldn't we allow the Philippines to set their own course and make their own determination? That was what the argument against annexation was, that the Philippines were their own country. They needed to stand up and be given self-rule because that's what American spirit was all about. Early on in the Philippines, we chose to take the route of annexation. We said we are going to make the Philippines a colony, if you will, of the United States. And during the first 3 years, we had to lead, our forces over there fought a series of battles against native Filipinos who, glad to be rid of Spain, wanted to be independent and not have the U.S. replace Spain as an imperial power. So there was rebellion for the first 3 years of our rule as the United States sought to gain control and to have influence over the Philippines. Now in early 1900s, the United States Congress passed the Philippine Government Act. The Philippine Government Act was also known as the Organic Act, which established U.S. title to the country. It really formalized that the U.S.-style government would be part of their country. It called for a governor with legislature, one to be elected by the people in the Philippines, one to be appointed by the U.S. Congress, with the governor appointed by the Congress. It was going to be a two-house with an executive type setup similar to the United States Congress, with the two houses of the legislature and, of course, the president. So we created the Philippine Government Act to help set up government. But then there are other problems. The issue becomes, do we want to necessarily leave control of this to the Philippines? After all, we have a vested interest in making sure the Philippines stay loyal to the United States. We have trade issues with China. We have regional security issues now that we're a world power. Do we want to let the Philippines go? So the Philippine Government Act said yes. The Jones Act of 1916 granted the Philippines the right to vote for their own representatives. So the Jones Act kind of extended the Philippine Government Act and said now all bodies, the governor and both houses of the Congress, should be voted on by the people in the Philippines. The Jones Act was a big step forward for self-determination of them. It broke the mold. This was also in 1916 when Woodrow Wilson, man who created the concept of new freedom for world policy, came about. And he influenced the debate over this and said, if we really believe in this country, in the spirit of freedom, in the spirit of democracy, in the spirit of self-rule, it's time for us to do as we say. In other words, it's time for us to have our actions follow up our words and grant the Philippines self-rule. In 1916, the Jones Act did just that. And in 1946, the Philippines broke all ties with the United States after World War II and becomes its own independent country. Today we got a chance to recount how Spain responded to the revolts they had going on in Cuba. We got a chance to discuss the major causes of the Spanish-American War, describe the major battles, the push up San Juan Hill and the capturing of the Philippines, the two major battles and two main areas of conflict during the Spanish-American War. And we got a chance to explain what happened to the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. First we had the Philippine Government Act trying to help set up a government for them. Then we had the Jones Act in 1916 that gave them self-determination. Finally, that was followed in 1946 after World War II with us recognizing the Philippines as an independent country, which it remains today.